The city was alive with the hum of traffic, the sharp scent of roasted chestnuts from street vendors filling the crisp autumn air. Downtown was buzzing with the usual chaos. People rushing to meetings, shop windows flashing colorful advertisements, and the occasional street performer bringing life to the sidewalks. In the heart of this chaotic metropolis stood a small, unassuming coffee shop, a haven for those who sought quiet amidst the madness. Its large bay windows offered a glimpse of the world outside, but within, it was a different universe, a space where time slowed down and conversations felt like private moments, each sip of coffee a comforting escape from the hustle beyond. It was here, in the warmth of a cup of coffee, that I first met her. Her name was Leah, and in a way, I almost didn't recognize her when she walked through the door. It had been years since I'd seen her, but her presence, her energy, was unmistakable. She had always been a force of nature, fiery, passionate, and unafraid to speak her mind. Even when life knocked her down, she stood tall, often with a smile that suggested she knew a secret that the rest of us didn't. When she entered, the coffee shop's chatter seemed to dim just a bit. People noticed her, even if they didn't know who she was. And I wasn't sure whether it was because of the aura she carried or because she had that uncanny ability to make even a crowd feel like a private audience. She was beautiful in a way that felt both effortless and deliberate, like someone who knew exactly what she wanted from the world but had no need to prove it. I had known Leah when we were younger, back when life was simpler, and the world seemed like it would stay the same forever. We had been inseparable during those years, friends, partners in crime, companions on an uncharted journey we thought would never end. But somewhere along the way, things changed. We both changed. The memories of her then, the way she had made me feel like the center of her universe, had faded. In their place, a quiet, lingering ache grew. She had left without warning, without explanation, and I was left in the wake of her absence, unsure of what had gone wrong. It wasn't that I didn't understand. People change. Life happens. But that didn't stop the sting of betrayal from settling in, souring everything she had once meant to me. And now, here she was standing before me. At first, it was almost as though the years hadn't passed. I watched her cross the room, her eyes scanning the small tables for an empty seat. And then, just as I was about to wave her off in the hopes of avoiding an awkward exchange, her gaze met mine. She froze for a moment, then smiled, the same mischievous smile that used to set my heart racing. Well, she said, her voice warmer than I expected, laced with a softness that seemed out of place given the circumstances. If it isn't the ghost of my past. I stood there, unsure whether to smile or shrink away, unsure of what this moment meant. She had a way of making the world feel like it was spinning just a little bit slower when she was around. But that same feeling of her presence, overwhelming, undeniable, also made me question everything I thought I knew. Before I could find the right words, she took a step closer, her eyes glinting with a curiosity I wasn't prepared for. "You still drink that horrible coffee?" she asked, gesturing to my half-finished cup with an arched brow. I let out a quiet laugh, the tension easing just a little. "It's the only thing that gets me through the day," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended, the weight of the years still hanging between us. She didn't respond to that right away. Instead, she sat down across from me, her posture casual, but there was something in the way she sat, relaxed, yet not entirely at ease. It was almost as if she was waiting for me to speak first. "You look different," I said finally, trying to fill the silence with something other than the memories of what had once been. Leah smiled faintly, but there was something guarded in her expression. "We both do," she replied, her gaze flickering briefly to the window, as though searching for something in the streets outside. I didn't know what to say next. There was a part of me that wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation for the years she had taken from me without so much as a word. But then another part, smaller, quieter, was afraid of what that might uncover. What if I wasn't ready for the truth? But before I could ask myself the question for too long, she spoke again. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you'd want to. Not after everything." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had thought about this moment countless times over the years, wondering if it would ever happen, and imagining all the things I might say. But now, with her sitting across from me, it felt like nothing could prepare me for the reality of it. I didn't think I would either, I said, the words slipping out before I had time to second-guess them. But here we are, and just like that, the years of silence between us seemed to crack open. The barrier of time, the one I'd built to protect myself from the hurt of her absence, began to feel irrelevant. It was just the two of us now, sitting in the midst of our past and everything we'd been through. But what happened next? That's where things got complicated, because she wasn't just here to apologize. She wasn't just here to explain. There was something else, something I didn't know if I was ready to hear. As she looked me in the eye, her expression serious, I could feel the weight of the words she was about to say. And in that moment, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back as days pass, tension between Alice and Thomas grows. At first, the cracks in their marriage were small, easily overlooked, an offhand comment, a quiet sigh, a missed dinner. But now, they're impossible to ignore. The emotional distance between them has widened, like a chasm they can't quite bridge, no matter how hard they try. The silence that once felt comfortable now feels suffocating. Alice notices how Thomas has become increasingly distracted, his mind drifting when he's supposed to be present. He's no longer the attentive husband who used to hold her hand during late-night talks or surprise her with spontaneous dates. Now, when he looks at her, it's as though he's seeing a stranger, and she's left wondering, where did we go wrong? She can't help but compare their relationship to the happy, carefree moments they used to share. The late-night walks around the neighborhood, the hours spent in bed talking about dreams and fears, things that now seem distant and unreal. Her thoughts are constantly consumed by this gnawing feeling that something is missing. She feels herself slipping away, like sand between her fingers, and Thomas, who once swore he'd never let her go, seems to be the one pulling away. Thomas, on the other hand, is quietly battling a storm of his own. He wants to love Alice. He genuinely does. But his career, the demands of life, and his own unresolved issues from the past have worn him thin. He's tired, not just physically, but emotionally. There's a weight on his chest that he can't explain, something he doesn't have the energy to unpack, even though he knows it's eating him alive. The guilt creeps in. He doesn't know how to fix what's broken, and every attempt to reach out only seems to push Alice further away. He feels like he's drowning in responsibilities, constantly having to prove himself in the world, at work, to his friends, to his family. But when it comes to Alice, the one person he's supposed to feel safe with, he's lost. He finds himself retreating into his work, his phone, anything to avoid the conversation that he knows they need to have, but can't bring himself to start. Alice starts to resent him for not seeing her, for not feeling her pain. She's fighting a battle on her own, trying to hold on to the pieces of their life together. When she confronts him, it's not with anger or bitterness, but with a quiet sadness that cuts deeper than any argument ever could. "I don't know what happened to us, Thomas," she says one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's not." Thomas turns away, his face shadowed in the dim light of their bedroom. The words hang in the air, heavy with unspoken truth. He wants to tell her he's been struggling too, that he's afraid he might be losing her. But the words never come. Instead, they sit in silence, the weight of their unspoken thoughts growing heavier by the second. Days turn into weeks, and the silence between them becomes unbearable. Alice starts to pull away emotionally, creating walls around herself that Thomas can't break through. She stops sharing her thoughts with him, stops waiting for him to come home. The hurt begins to fester, and with every unanswered question, with every missed opportunity to connect, the love they once shared feels like a distant memory. Thomas, desperate to make things right, but unsure how, tries to do what he always did: solve things. He buys her flowers, takes her out for dinner, tries to plan a weekend getaway to revive the romance. But it's too late. The cracks have already become too deep. Alice isn't looking for grand gestures anymore. She's looking for a real, honest conversation, a chance for them to face the reality of what they've become and decide if they can rebuild from the wreckage. In the midst of all this, a moment of clarity strikes Alice. She sees her reflection in a store window and doesn't recognize the woman staring back at her. She's become someone who waits for love, rather than someone who lives in it. She's lost herself in trying to hold on to something that might no longer be there. That realization stings. For the first time, she wonders if she's been holding on for the wrong reasons. Has she been fighting for a relationship that no longer exists? Or worse, is she just afraid of being alone? It's this uncertainty that gnaws at her late at night when she lies awake, the space beside her cold and empty. She thinks about how she's always put everyone else's needs ahead of her own, trying to make everyone happy, trying to fix things that were never hers to fix. But at what cost? Thomas, too, has moments of reckoning. He's aware of the growing distance, but refuses to admit how bad things have become. He tells himself he's just going through a rough patch, that things will get better once he's got everything under control. But deep down, he knows that he's losing Alice, and he's terrified of what that might mean for him. He spends nights pacing, grappling with his emotions, trying to figure out how he got here. There's no one to turn to, no one who truly understands the depths of the turmoil he's experiencing. The pressure to be everything, to be perfect, strong, and supportive, has taken its toll, and he doesn't know how to pull himself out of the pit he's dug. Every attempt at reconciliation feels like a half-hearted gesture, because in his heart he knows he's not being fully honest with Alice or himself. As the days drag on, the conflict deepens. Both Alice and Thomas are trapped in their own spirals of hurt and pride. What they once had a deep, unwavering connection now feels like a memory, fading with every unspoken word, every missed touch, every ignored glance. They've reached a point where they can no longer ignore the truth. If they want to save this marriage, they'll have to confront the reality of what they've become and whether there's enough left to rebuild. But they're both afraid that, in facing the truth, they might lose everything. In the world of storytelling, relationships between characters are the heart and soul of a compelling narrative. Developing these relationships thoughtfully, with nuance and authenticity, creates a strong emotional connection between the reader and the characters. When a character's motivations, conflicts, and growth are driven by their interactions with others, it transforms a simple story into something more meaningful. The challenge lies not just in creating these relationships, but in making them feel real, unpredictable, and dynamic. One of the first steps in developing relationships is to ensure that characters have clear, individual personalities. Each character should come across as distinct, with their own values, desires, and weaknesses. The chemistry between two characters becomes much more compelling when they are opposites, or when their internal struggles mirror each other. For instance, a confident character might be paired with someone more reserved, creating an interesting dynamic of tension and growth as they learn from each other. Alternatively, characters with similar traits might evolve in different directions, forcing them to confront each other in ways that challenge their beliefs or self-perception. What makes relationships even more complex is their ability to evolve. These transformations should be gradual, based on actions, choices, and external pressures. Think about how a friendship grows from mere acquaintanceship into something deep and abiding, or how a romantic relationship transitions from initial attraction to a shared commitment. This progression is often a journey for both characters, filled with ups and downs. A relationship that starts in conflict, whether due to misunderstanding, betrayal, or differing goals, can develop into one of mutual respect or even love as both parties change. These transformations often come with a series of tests, challenges that force the characters to confront their past actions, their hidden vulnerabilities, and ultimately, each other. The importance of dialogue in developing relationships cannot be overstated. Words are the conduit through which characters reveal their feelings, opinions, and histories. Through dialogue, misunderstandings can be addressed, emotions can be laid bare, and moments of connection are forged. The way characters speak to each other, whether with tenderness, sarcasm, or anger, reveals much about their relationship. In some cases, What isn't said can be just as important as the words themselves, leaving room for subtext and unspoken tension. Conflict is another critical element in developing relationships. Every relationship, whether familial, platonic, or romantic, will inevitably face some form of struggle. Conflict might arise from external forces, a looming crisis, societal pressures, or a shared antagonist. But it can also come from within the characters themselves: jealousy, resentment, guilt, or the fear of vulnerability. These conflicts don't need to be resolved immediately. In fact, sometimes leaving unresolved tension can add richness to the narrative, keeping the relationship dynamic and ever-changing. Growth within relationships often comes when characters make sacrifices for each other, or when one person has to let go of something important for the sake of the other. These moments are pivotal because they show the depth of the bond. When a character is willing to risk their own well-being for another's, the relationship shifts into something more profound. Sometimes, though, growth also involves walking away from a relationship that is no longer healthy. Recognizing the need for separation, even when love or loyalty is still present, can be an equally powerful moment of character development. In the end, the most memorable relationships are those that feel grounded in reality. Even in fantastical or highly dramatic settings, relationships should mirror the complexities, struggles, and joys of real life. By allowing characters to experience moments of vulnerability, conflict, and growth, you create relationships that resonate with readers on an emotional level. When done right, these relationships don't just propel the plot, they deepen the story, making it unforgettable. The morning after the conversation with Claire, Max couldn't shake the weight of their exchange. What had started as a flippant remark about moving on had turned into a silent war between them, one that neither had the courage to confront head-on. Max had hoped, naively, that time would heal the sharp edges of their relationship, but that morning it only seemed to have made them more brittle. As he prepared his usual cup of coffee, the routine of it felt almost cruel, a reminder that things were irrevocably different now. He glanced at Claire as she sat across from him, scrolling through her phone, her eyes glued to the screen. The distance between them wasn't just physical. It had grown wider with every day spent in silence, avoiding the conversation neither of them was ready to have. "Do you think we've changed?" Max finally asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. Claire didn't look up. She just shrugged, her usual easy smile replaced by something more distant. "I think we're both just tired," she said quietly, her words more thoughtful than he'd expected. For a moment, Max felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they could still talk about it. But the flicker quickly died when Claire stood up, gathering her things. "I'll be back late tonight. Got a meeting with the team. You know how it is," she added, her voice drifting off as she grabbed her bag. It wasn't an apology, nor an explanation. It was just the usual, her way of avoiding anything deeper. Max stayed in the kitchen for a long moment after she left, his coffee growing cold in front of him. Later that afternoon, when Max returned to their apartment after a long day at work, he found her sitting at the kitchen table, deep in conversation with someone on the phone. Her back was to him, but he could hear the sharpness in her voice, a tone that wasn't meant for him to hear. It was different from the way she usually spoke. He'd seen this side of her before, but it had been a long time. The kind of side that was hidden behind a carefully curated version of herself. The one that had her meeting clients, the polished version who smiled in public and kept her emotions neatly tucked away. Max didn't interrupt. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her, feeling an unfamiliar pang in his chest. He hated that he'd been reduced to this, observing from the sidelines as she lived a life that seemed increasingly distant from his own. She was always moving forward, getting things done. And Max? He was still stuck with his thoughts, stuck with his insecurities, stuck with this sinking feeling that something important was slipping away. When she finally hung up, she turned toward him with a tight smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm going to need a few things done around here. I'll text you later." Max nodded silently, not trusting himself to speak. As she left the room, he found himself staring at the empty space she'd just occupied, the silence settling like a heavy blanket. In the following days, Max continued to feel the subtle shift between them. Every conversation felt like an effort, a performance neither of them could quite perfect. It was as if they were dancing around the truth, each afraid to make the first move that might bring everything crashing down. Max had never been good with confrontation. The truth, however small, always seemed to come with a price. But he couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, after another evening spent with a hollowed-out conversation that ended with both of them retreating into their respective worlds, Max decided to take a chance. He stood by the window, watching the city below as it buzzed with life. People seemed to move with purpose, with certainty. He wondered how many of them were as lost as he was. He took a deep breath and walked toward Claire, who was already curling up on the couch with her book. The silence was deafening. He needed to say something before they became strangers living under the same roof. "Claire," he said, his voice unsure but steady. She glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, I don't know what to do anymore," Max said, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I don't know how we got here, but I feel like we're stuck. And I don't know if we're ever going to move forward unless we talk about it." She didn't respond immediately, but her gaze softened, like she wasn't ready to face what he was saying but couldn't ignore it either. For a brief moment, there was hope in her eyes, a hope that maybe this wasn't the end. "I know," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "I don't know how to fix this either." And for the first time in weeks, Max felt like they were no longer on opposite sides of an invisible wall. They were in it together, even if the way forward seemed unclear. He took a tentative step closer, sitting next to her on the couch. Neither of them spoke for a while, but it didn't feel awkward. It just felt like the beginning of something they hadn't dared to face until now. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the weeks that followed were marked by a restless tension, a constant back and forth between effort and avoidance. Max and Claire tried, in their own ways, to bridge the growing gap between them, but it felt like every step forward was met with 2 steps back. They had moments, fleeting and fragile, where they almost seemed to touch the version of themselves they once were, before the silence, before the distance. But those moments were rare and increasingly hard to hold on to. Max made small attempts to bring them back to what they had, like planning a dinner out or suggesting they revisit the places they had once loved. But every gesture, every attempt seemed to fall flat. Claire would smile, say something polite, but there was always a heaviness in her voice, a tiredness that suggested she wasn't really there. Not fully, at least. It was as if she was too far ahead of him, lost in some other space he couldn't follow. One evening, Max returned home late from a long day at work. He was already drained, his mind consumed with thoughts of the presentation he'd just wrapped up. But as he walked into the apartment, something felt off. The light in the living room was dim, and there was an eerie silence hanging in the air. Claire wasn't there. Her things were scattered around, like usual, but there was no sign of her. He paused for a moment, confused, then glanced at his phone. He had missed a text from her. "I'm staying at my friend Rachel's tonight. Just needed some space. I'll be back tomorrow." Max stared at the screen, the words doing something strange to his stomach. Space. He had hoped that things might improve, that maybe, just maybe, they could start talking about the things that had been unsaid for so long. But now, even the small steps he'd taken felt pointless. Space. The word felt like an admission, as if Claire needed distance, not just from the apartment, but from him. He sat down on the couch, staring at the walls that had once felt so comforting, so familiar. Now, they felt like barriers, like the walls of a room he was slowly being shut out of. He picked up the remote and clicked through the channels absently, his mind replaying the words Claire had said during their last conversation, the one that hadn't gone anywhere. He could still hear the hesitation in her voice, the way she had skirted around his questions, never really addressing the heart of the issue. It was always just a little bit too much, too uncomfortable to face. The next day, when Claire came back, she was quieter than usual. There were no explanations, no apologies, just a soft smile and a murmur about the weather. Max knew that something had shifted, but she wasn't ready to acknowledge it. He wanted to press, to ask her what she needed, but there was a part of him, a stubborn part, that wanted to wait for her to come to him first. After all, hadn't he already tried? Hadn't he already laid himself bare? But waiting didn't work. The next week, he found himself buried under a mountain of work again. the project at his job spiraling out of control. He barely had time to think about anything else, least of all the gnawing feeling that his relationship with Claire was slipping through his fingers. She seemed distant, like a ghost in their shared space. They spoke less and less, and when they did, it was mostly about logistics, what time they'd be home, what needed to be done around the apartment. The emotional distance was growing, and Max didn't know how to close the gap. It wasn't just that the silence was uncomfortable, it was that it felt suffocating. There were nights when Max lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was it, if they had reached the point where they couldn't go back. He'd read somewhere that relationships were built on shared moments, and it seemed like the only moments they shared now were the ones where they avoided looking at each other for too long. Even the small things, holding hands, exchanging glances, those little acts of affection, were gone. In their place was a kind of polite indifference. One evening, Claire came home looking especially frazzled. Max, too tired to mask his growing frustration, greeted her with a simple, "How was your day?" She responded with a distracted smile, and for a moment, it felt like everything had returned to normal. But then, as she passed by him, he noticed something in her eyes, a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. Something had happened while she was out, something that had nothing to do with him. "Are you okay?" Max asked, his voice cautious, his heart picking up its pace. Claire paused, her back still turned. For a moment, she didn't answer, and in that silence, everything felt heavier. Then, she turned to face him, her expression tight. "I'm fine, just tired. It's been a long day." Max studied her, not buying it for a second. "You sure? You seem off." She sighed and dropped her bag on the couch, running her hands through her hair. "I'm just dealing with stuff. It's been a lot lately." Max opened his mouth to ask more, to dig deeper, but then he stopped himself. What good would it do? He could already feel the wall rising between them, and if he pushed now, it would only make things worse. So instead, they both pretended. Claire retreated into her thoughts, and Max buried himself in his own. They ate dinner in silence, the only sound the clink of their utensils against their plates. The tension between them was like a third presence at the table, unspoken and undeniable. Neither of them knew how to face it, so they didn't. Days turned into weeks, and the emotional distance between them only deepened. Max couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of a breaking point, but every time he tried to talk to Claire about it, she deflected or shut him down. It was as if their connection had become too fragile to fix, too strained to repair. There were moments when Max questioned if it was worth it anymore. Would it be easier to let go? Could he really keep fighting for something that felt so out of reach? The complications were piling up. The more they tried to patch things together, the more they realized that the cracks were bigger than either of them had imagined. They weren't just struggling with the little things, they were struggling with themselves. And that was something neither of them had prepared for. The rain fell in steady sheets outside, blurring the city lights through the window as Claire sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the coffee cup in front of her. The steam rose from it like wisps of forgotten memories. Memories she didn't like to revisit but couldn't seem to escape. She hadn't thought about those early years with Max in a long time. Not really, not with everything that had changed between them. But tonight, as the storm rattled against the glass, they crept in anyway. It was the small things that always brought it all back. A song on the radio, a shared look across a crowded room, the smell of the rain on the pavement. And suddenly, Claire was back in the early days of their relationship, when everything felt new and full of possibility. Max had been different then, more carefree, less burdened by the weight of the world. He had a kind of ease about him that made Claire feel like she could let go, even if just for a moment. He didn't need her to be anyone other than herself, and that felt like a kind of freedom. They were just two people figuring it out, sharing the same small apartment, laughing over takeout, talking about their dreams at 2 a.m., as if the world outside could wait. She smiled to herself at the memory, remembering how Max had always been the one to push her out of her comfort zone. He was spontaneous, always suggesting crazy ideas. Like that one night when he decided they should drive out to the beach just because the moon was full. No plan, no reason, just a desire to do something out of the ordinary, to feel alive in a way that neither of them had been taught to do before. They spent the night by the water, feet in the sand, talking about their pasts and their futures, making promises they didn't know how to keep but swore they would. And for the first time in years, Claire felt hopeful. But now, as she sat in the silence of their apartment, everything felt different. That version of them, the one that was so full of light, of hope, felt distant, like a dream she wasn't sure she'd ever really had. She had to remind herself that it was real once, that it was possible to be that carefree, that happy. But somewhere along the way, they had stopped dreaming together. They'd stopped planning. Instead of spontaneous road trips, it was just routine, jobs, deadlines, the slow burn of disappointment building between them. Max wasn't the same. She wasn't the same. She couldn't help but think about the first time they really fought. That moment when they realized that love wasn't enough to hold everything together. It had been over something small, some miscommunication about plans, something so trivial that in hindsight it barely mattered. But the fight itself felt like a crack in the foundation they had built. It had surprised them both, how quickly things had escalated. They'd always been so in sync, so comfortable. But suddenly, there they were shouting, saying things they didn't mean, tears spilling out before they could stop them. Max had apologized first, of course. He always did. He was the fixer, the one who wanted to smooth things over. Claire hated that she needed him to apologize, but she did. She needed him to prove that he still cared, that they weren't just two people trapped in a relationship that had run its course. It wasn't even about the fight anymore. It was about whether they could weather the storm together. They hadn't been sure. They'd both been afraid that if they didn't make it through that night, they might never find their way back to each other. But somehow they had. They always had. There had been a part of Claire that was sure they would always figure it out. The love between them felt strong enough to overcome anything until it didn't. Then there were the moments before everything started to fall apart. The slow burn of disconnection that neither of them wanted to acknowledge, even though it was right in front of them. Claire remembered how Max's smile had started to fade, how his eyes had stopped lighting up when she walked into a room. He was always distracted, always somewhere else. The conversations grew quieter, the silences longer. It wasn't one big thing. It was 1,000 little things. Missed phone calls, forgotten promises, nights spent apart when they used to spend every night together. She had tried to ignore it at first, telling herself it was just a phase, that work was stressful, that life had gotten in the way. But the truth was, Claire had begun to feel invisible. And Max, he wasn't the man he used to be either. He was lost, trapped in his own world of expectations and responsibilities. He had become distant, not just from her, but from everything that once mattered. His work had consumed him, and the more he climbed the ladder, the more disconnected he seemed to become. Claire had tried to reach him, to understand what was happening, but every time she did, she felt more like an outsider in her own life. She had stopped trying to pull him back, stopped fighting for their connection, because it felt like fighting for something that had already slipped through her fingers. In the quiet moments, when they were alone and the world seemed too loud, Claire would let herself remember what it had been like in the beginning. She would think about how Max had made her feel special, like she mattered in a way that no one else ever had. He had made her feel seen. He had made her feel worthy. Now, though, she wasn't sure if she recognized herself in those memories anymore. She wasn't sure if she was the same person who had smiled at him in the middle of the night and whispered about forever. The woman who had once been so sure of herself, so full of life, now felt like a shadow of someone she used to be. The distance between them had grown so much that she wasn't sure if they could ever close the gap again. And deep down, Claire was scared. Scared of what their future might look like. Scared of losing herself completely in the wreckage of a relationship that had once seemed so certain. As the rain continued to fall outside, Claire closed her eyes, trying to push the flood of memories away. She knew that in order to move forward, she would need to face them, both the good and the bad. Because whether she was ready to admit it or not, the past was part of who they were. And as much as she wanted to look away, the only way out of the dark was through it. For better or worse, she and Max had built something together, something real. But it wasn't enough anymore, and Claire wasn't sure if she could keep pretending it was. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, Coming back, the days that followed Claire's quiet departure for Rachel's house felt heavier for Max than he cared to admit. He tried to throw himself into work, but his mind kept drifting back to their last conversation. The hesitation in Claire's eyes, the distance in her voice, the way she had shut herself off without saying a word. Something had shifted, and no amount of effort on his part seemed to make a difference. He felt like he was losing her slowly, and worse, he didn't know how to stop it. For a while, he considered just letting things run their course, convincing himself that maybe this was just a phase, that everything would go back to normal once the pressure of their lives died down. But deep down, Max knew that wasn't true. The silence between them wasn't a temporary issue. It was something more permanent, something that had been building for a long time. And every time he tried to talk to Claire, she either brushed him off or distracted him with something else. He couldn't figure out what had changed, but the more he tried to hold on, the more she seemed to slip away. One evening, after another long day at work, Max walked into the apartment, already dreading the emptiness of it. He hadn't seen Claire all day, and for the first time, he didn't feel the usual pull to check his phone for her messages, or to seek her out. The distance had worn him down. He was tired of chasing something that no longer felt real. But that night, everything changed. He stepped into the living room to find Claire sitting on the couch, her arms wrapped around herself, staring out of the window. She hadn't noticed him at first, but when she did, she looked almost surprised, as if she hadn't expected him to come home at all. "Claire," Max said, his voice hoarse, even to his own ears. He cleared his throat, then walked over and sat down beside her. For the first time in what felt like ages, the space between them felt smaller. "You're back early." Claire gave him a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. She shook her head slightly, almost as if she were in disbelief. "I was thinking about what you said. About us." Max's heart raced in his chest. He had been hoping for this moment, the chance to finally confront what was happening between them. But he wasn't prepared for how it felt in the moment. It was a strange mixture of relief and dread. Whatever was coming, he knew it would change everything. "Okay," Max said, trying to keep his voice steady, though he could feel the nerves creeping up on him. "What do you mean? What are you thinking?" Claire hesitated for a long moment, her fingers playing with the hem of her sleeve, as though she were trying to steady herself. Max waited, trying not to push her, but the silence stretched too long, and his impatience began to bubble up. He needed to know, needed her to say it out loud, whatever it was. "I've been thinking about how we got here," Claire finally spoke, her voice quiet, almost like she was speaking to herself. "And why I'm not happy anymore. It's not just about you, Max. It's about me. I've been avoiding it for a while now, but I can't ignore it any longer. The truth is I've been miserable for months, and I don't know if I can keep pretending that everything's fine." Max felt a chill run down his spine, his pulse quickening. He knew this was coming, but hearing it out loud still hit him like a punch. "Miserable," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't sure if he was asking for clarification or just trying to make sense of what she had just said. Claire nodded, her eyes avoiding his. "I've lost myself, Max. I don't even recognize who I am anymore. I thought I could keep it together, work harder, keep pushing through, but I've been so focused on keeping everything going, I've lost sight of what I want. What I need." Max's heart sank. The words hit him harder than he expected. He knew their relationship had been struggling, but to hear Claire say it so plainly made everything so much more real. He hadn't understood just how deep her unhappiness ran. He'd thought it was just the usual stress, the growing pains of adulthood, but Claire's words were like a revelation that shattered the illusion he had been clinging to. "Is that what this is about?" Max asked, struggling to control the shakiness in his voice. "You've been unhappy for months, and you're just telling me now?" Claire turned her head to face him, her expression pained. "I didn't know how to say it, Max. I didn't know how to explain that I'm not the person I was when we first got together. And neither are you. You've changed too. We both changed." Max stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. He had always believed that relationships were about adapting together, about weathering the storms as a unit. But the more Claire spoke, the more it became clear that they were no longer on the same path. They had drifted apart without even realizing it, both of them so caught up in their own lives that they had stopped paying attention to each other. "I don't know if I want to be in this anymore, Max," Claire continued, her voice breaking, though she quickly wiped away the tear that had escaped. I don't think I can keep pretending I'm okay when I'm not. Max felt a rush of emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, and then a profound sadness. So that's it? He asked, his voice cracking. You're just gonna walk away? Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with a kind of sorrow he couldn't bear to see. I don't want to walk away, but I don't know if I have a choice anymore. I can't keep living in a relationship where I'm constantly questioning myself, where I don't even know who I am anymore. I need space, Max. I need to figure things out. Max opened his mouth to argue, to convince her that they could fix things, that they could find a way back to each other. But something stopped him. The look in Claire's eyes told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't asking for space. She was telling him it was over. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The words were out there now, and nothing could take them back. Claire's confession had hit Max harder than anything he had imagined. The realization that they had reached this point, that they had gone so far off course without even realizing it, left him feeling hollow. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know how to move forward from this revelation. All he knew was that everything had changed in an instant. What had seemed so certain was now a fragile, delicate thing, teetering on the edge of collapse. The future that they had once shared felt uncertain, like a dream slipping further and further away. Claire's words echoed in his mind. I've lost myself. Max realized too late that he had lost himself in the process as well. And now, in this silence that stretched between them, he didn't know if they could ever find their way back. The days following Claire's revelation were marked by a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to hang over everything. Max couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking on fragile ground. Each step a careful calculation, each word spoken a potential misstep. Claire had made it clear she wasn't sure if she wanted to be in this relationship anymore. And that simple truth was like a crack in the foundation of everything they had built, spreading further with each passing day. Max had always been the type to fix things. He was a problem solver by nature. When something was wrong, he faced it head-on, determined to find a solution. But with Claire, nothing felt fixable anymore. He wasn't sure if it was the relationship that needed fixing or if it was something deeper, something within them both, that couldn't be repaired with a conversation or a gesture. At work, Max was a mess. His usually sharp focus had dulled, and he found himself zoning out during meetings, his mind drifting back to Claire. Was she really done? Was it possible to go back to what they had? He couldn't get rid of the image of her sitting on the couch, her face pale, her eyes full of something he couldn't name. He could still hear her voice in his head. I've lost myself. The words kept repeating in his mind, like a haunting refrain, and he couldn't help but wonder if she was right. It wasn't just that Claire had expressed her doubts. It was the way she had said it. There had been a finality to her tone, something that made Max realize she wasn't just speaking out of frustration or fatigue. She was speaking from a deeper, more painful place, one that he hadn't known existed in her. And the realization that she had been carrying that pain for so long, silently, without ever letting him in, was something he couldn't ignore. Their interactions in the days that followed felt like careful choreography. Max would try to engage, asking her about her day, trying to break through the coldness that had settled between them. Claire would respond, but it was always short, always distant. There were no more long conversations, no more late-night talks about their future. Instead, they exchanged polite pleasantries, as if they were strangers sharing the same space rather than partners who once knew each other's deepest thoughts. One night, Max returned home to find Claire sitting at the kitchen table, scribbling something in a notebook. Her brow was furrowed, her face hidden behind her hair as she worked, but there was something about the way she held herself that sent a pang through his chest. It was as if she was living in a different world now, a world where he wasn't welcome. Hey, Max said, trying to sound casual, though his voice betrayed him. What are you working on? Claire looked up, her expression blank, and for a moment, Max could have sworn he saw a flicker of something. Regret? Guilt? Before it was quickly masked by indifference. Just some ideas for a project I'm planning. Nothing special. Max nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. He had stopped asking questions after the last few conversations. Every time he pried, It felt like he was only pushing her further away. She was slipping from him, and he didn't know how to stop it. He tried again later that evening when they were sitting on the couch. It wasn't much, just a quiet evening after dinner, both of them retreating to their own spaces. But Max couldn't stand the tension between them anymore. It was too much, too suffocating. "Claire," his voice faltered, and he hated himself for it. But he couldn't stop himself. He needed to know, Are we still in this? I don't want to push you, but it feels like we're just existing next to each other. And I don't know how to fix it if I don't know what you're thinking." Claire didn't look up at him right away. She stared at her hands, her fingers tracing patterns in the fabric of her sweater. Max could feel her pulling further away, the walls around her heart growing higher, and the desperation in him rose, sharp and suffocating. "I told you, Max. I don't know," she said finally, her voice low and exhausted. "I can't tell you what I'm thinking when I'm not even sure myself. I'm just trying to figure out who I am right now." Max swallowed hard, the words lodged in his throat. "You're not the only one who's lost, Claire," he said, his voice tighter than he intended. "I don't know who I am anymore either, but I'm still trying. I'm still here." She turned her face away, her jaw clenched. Max could feel the shift in the air. The moment when the words they were both afraid to say finally started to settle between them. She had pulled away, and he had let her. He had been so caught up in his own confusion, his own frustration, that he hadn't noticed the subtle signs that she was already starting to slip out of reach. He hadn't realized just how deeply she had been struggling. "Maybe that's the problem," Claire whispered, more to herself than to him. "You've always been so sure of yourself, Max. You know who you are, what you want. But I don't, and I don't think I ever have." The word stung, sharp and cutting. Max felt like the air had been knocked out of him, like she had just exposed a truth he had never been willing to face. She had always looked at him like he had the answers, like he had the key to everything. But now, as the silence stretched between them, he realized that he didn't have any answers at all. They sat there in the dim light of the living room, the tension thick and suffocating. Claire wasn't looking at him anymore, and Max didn't know how to bridge the gap. He didn't know how to fix what was broken, and that terrified him more than anything else. And then, as if the universe had decided to rub salt into the wound, his phone buzzed. It was a message from work, another deadline, another problem that demanded his attention. But Max couldn't focus on that right now. His heart was too heavy, his thoughts too scattered. As he glanced over at Claire, sitting so still, so distant, he couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. Maybe this was it. Maybe the moment they had both been avoiding had finally arrived. They were no longer two people who simply drifted apart. No, they were at the point of no return, standing at the edge of something they couldn't fix, no matter how hard they tried. Max had always believed that love could conquer anything, but now, as he watched Claire stare at the empty space between them, he wasn't so sure anymore. Maybe love wasn't enough to undo the damage. Maybe the best they could do now was admit that they had both changed, and that sometimes change meant letting go. The days after that moment felt like they were suspended in time, each one dragging on with unbearable slowness. Max tried to keep busy, burying himself in work and distractions, but nothing seemed to work. His thoughts were constantly drawn back to Claire, to their fractured relationship, to the space that had grown between them. It was as if the world outside had faded into a blur, while the tension inside their apartment was all-consuming. Every time he saw Claire, it felt like a confrontation. Not a loud, angry argument, but a quiet, suffocating weight that both of them could feel, even if they didn't speak about it. It was the unspoken truth, the way they were slowly unraveling, and neither of them knew how to stop it. Claire had become even more withdrawn. She spent hours holed up in her room, immersed in her own thoughts or scribbling in notebooks, her silence more pronounced than ever. Max couldn't help but wonder if she was planning her exit, if she had already decided that it was time to leave. He had tried to talk to her, tried to break through the distance, but every attempt had been met with silence or vague answers that only deepened his frustration. Then one night it all came to a head. Max had been pacing around the apartment for hours, his mind a swirl of conflicting thoughts. He could feel his emotions simmering just below the surface, a mix of anger, confusion and desperation. He had tried to be patient, tried to give Claire the space she had asked for, but the truth was he couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't stand the constant ache of not knowing where they stood, of feeling like he was losing her without being able to do anything about it. He found Claire in the living room, sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, but not really watching it. Her posture was closed off, arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she were trying to shield herself from the world. Max stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, his heart aching. He had never felt so disconnected from her in his life. It was like they were two strangers living in the same space, sharing the same air, but unable to touch. "Claire," Max finally said, his voice rough from the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between them. "We need to talk." She didn't look at him right away. There was a long pause before she slowly turned her head, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was deafening, and it cut through him like a knife. "I can't keep doing this," Max continued, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not. I can't keep walking around here like we're both waiting for something to change, when neither of us is doing anything to fix it." Claire's gaze flickered to him, then back to the floor. Her hands clenched in a fist on her lap. Max could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was holding herself together by sheer will. It made something inside of him break. She was so strong, but it was clear she had been carrying all of this on her own, and he hadn't even seen it. "I'm not asking for things to be perfect," Max said, stepping closer, his voice cracking slightly. "I just want to know what's going on. What are you thinking, Claire? What do you need?" Claire's eyes finally met his, and there was an unmistakable weariness in them. "I need you to stop," she said quietly, the words slipping out like a secret she had been holding onto for far too long. "I need you to stop trying to fix everything. I need you to stop acting like you can solve all of this with a conversation or a gesture. This isn't something you can fix, Max." Max felt a cold wave of disbelief wash over him. "What do you mean stop?" he asked, his voice rising despite himself. "This is something we can fix. We're in this together, Claire. I can't just sit here and watch you pull away from me without trying to do something." Claire's eyes burned with frustration, her voice shaking. "That's the problem, Max. You don't get it. You don't understand how exhausting it is to keep pretending. I'm not the person I was when we first met. I'm not the person you think I am. And you can't keep expecting me to be that version of myself just because it makes you feel better." The words hit Max like a punch to the stomach. He took a step back, his mind racing, but he couldn't seem to make sense of what she was saying. "I'm not expecting anything, Claire. I just want to know if there's a chance. If there's something we can do to save this." Claire stood up suddenly, her hands trembling. "I don't even know if I want to save it anymore, Max," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. "I don't know if I even remember why I stayed in the first place. Maybe I was just trying to hold on to something that was never really there. Maybe I was just trying to convince myself that I was happy because I thought it was the right thing to do. But I'm not happy anymore, and I don't know if I can keep living in this constant state of nothingness." Max stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. The words felt like a dagger, and he couldn't breathe through the suffocating pressure that had built up in the room. This wasn't a fight anymore. It wasn't an argument. This was the raw truth. Claire was breaking, and he was powerless to stop it. "I'm sorry," Max said, his voice barely audible. He didn't know what else to say. The realization was too much. He had tried so hard to keep everything together, to be the solution, to fix things. But now, standing in front of her, he realized that he wasn't the answer. He wasn't enough to solve the mess they had become. Claire looked at him for a long moment, her face twisted with pain. "Maybe it's time to let go," she whispered. "Maybe we're just two people who were never meant to be together. And maybe we've spent so much time trying to force it that we've forgotten what it means to just be." Max felt like the ground had just slipped out from under him. His hands trembled as he reached for her, but Claire took a step back, shaking her head. "I can't do this anymore, Max," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry." Max's breath hitched, his chest tightening as he realized that this was the moment he had been dreading. The moment he had tried to avoid. The moment where all the unspoken feelings, the fear, the regrets came crashing down. I don't want to lose you, he whispered, his voice barely a breath. Claire didn't answer, her gaze soft but resolute. Slowly, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Max standing in the silence. The weight of her absence settled in around him, suffocating him with its finality. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space she had just left, and for the first time, he understood what it meant to truly be lost. He had never felt so small. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, Max couldn't remember when he had started walking, but the cold air on his skin felt like a slap in the face, sharp and real. His footsteps were aimless, each one dragging him further away from the apartment, further away from Claire and the life they had built together, piece by fragile piece. He needed to get out, needed to move, to think, because the weight of everything was suffocating him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't look at it. He wasn't in the mood for distractions, not now. He didn't know where he was going, just that he needed space, something to help him breathe again. The city felt endless around him, a blur of lights and sounds, but none of it reached him. All he could hear in his mind was Claire's voice. I'm not happy anymore. I don't know if I want to be here. The words kept replaying, turning in his gut like something poisoned. He thought about all the times he had pushed her to talk, to confront what was wrong, and yet he never really listened. Not deeply. Not to the part of her that had been unraveling, quietly, without him even knowing. He had been so focused on holding on fixing things, that he hadn't realized that maybe, just maybe, it was too late for that. Max's legs carried him to the park near their building. The place where they had taken walks together in the early days of their relationship, when everything had felt easy and simple. He sat on the nearest bench, his hands gripping the cold metal of the armrest as his mind raced, but he couldn't stop it. He could still see Claire, the way her eyes had been full of sadness, like a story she wasn't ready to tell. And then, like a bolt of lightning, it hit him. She wasn't asking him to fix it. She wasn't asking for some grand gesture, some elaborate act to prove his love or devotion. She was asking for space to figure out who she was, to get back to herself. And he hadn't given her that. Instead, he had tried to force everything back to the way it used to be, to recapture some idealized version of their past. But Claire had changed. They both had. He realized, with a deep pang of regret, that love wasn't about holding on tight to someone for fear of losing them. It was about letting them go, giving them the room to be who they were meant to be, even if it meant stepping away for a while. He had never understood that until now. His phone buzzed again, and this time he checked it. It was a message from Rachel. We need to talk. It's important. Max frowned, his chest tightening. What could Rachel possibly want to talk about? She had been there for Claire through everything, and he knew she had never fully approved of their relationship. Rachel had always believed Claire deserved more, deserved better than someone like Max. But this wasn't the time to be angry at her. This was about Claire. Without thinking, he called Rachel. Max, she answered, her voice low but clear. Where are you? Claire's been looking for you. He stopped for a moment, the words catching in his throat. I don't know what to do anymore, Rachel. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if you can fix it, Max, Rachel said, her voice soft, almost too soft. But you can stop making it harder. Claire's been holding on to you, trying to make this work for so long, but she can't keep pretending. She needs you to listen, Max. Not to solve things, not to fix her, but to understand that she needs to find herself again. Without you, without the relationship, without all of it, Max's heart dropped. He had heard those words before, but hearing Rachel say them with such raw honesty made it feel like a gut punch. He had been blind to it. He hadn't seen how much Claire had been carrying alone, how much of herself she had given up in order to try and keep their relationship together. He had been too focused on himself to truly understand her. Are you saying she's done? Max asked, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't know why he asked. He knew the answer, but he couldn't bring himself to face it. I'm saying that if you keep pushing her, Max, if you keep trying to make this work when she's not ready, when you aren't ready to change, you'll lose her for good. You're not the same people anymore. But if you really care about her, if you want to do right by her, you have to let her go. Give her the space she's asking for. Max's heart clenched, but something inside him shifted. There was a finality in Rachel's words. but there was also a deep understanding. Rachel wasn't telling him to give up on Claire. She was telling him to let go so Claire could come back to herself. And maybe, just maybe, if they both found their way back to who they truly were, they could rebuild. With trembling hands, Max ended the call. He sat there for a while, staring out at the night sky, the city lights flickering in the distance. He felt like everything inside of him was falling apart, but in that moment, he knew he had to do the hardest thing of all: let Claire go, if only for a little while. When he finally stood up and turned back toward the apartment, his mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. The weight wasn't gone, but it was lighter. He knew that he wasn't the same person he was when he had first started this journey with Claire. But maybe, just maybe, this was what they both needed: a break from each other, a break to find out who they really were. And if they still had love left in them, if they still had the strength to face each other once the dust had settled, maybe they could rebuild. But that was something only time could answer. As Max walked back into the apartment, the door creaking softly behind him, he felt a deep sense of uncertainty in his chest. But there was something else too, a strange peace. The tension that had been suffocating him for weeks had lifted, even if only a little. Claire wasn't in the apartment when he walked in, and for a long moment, Max stood at the threshold, unsure of what to do next. He didn't have the answers. He didn't even know what would happen to their relationship. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally starting to understand. The future wasn't something to control. It was something to live, to experience, and to trust. And if Claire was meant to be in his life, he would have to trust that she would come back when she was ready. The door to Claire's room was slightly ajar, and Max hesitated for a moment before he knocked. There was no response. He pushed the door open slowly and stood there, looking at the empty room, the bed, the scattered clothes, the place where they had shared so much together. He took a deep breath and then, with quiet resolve, he sat down in the chair by the window. The future, whatever it held, was uncertain. But in that moment, Max knew one thing for sure: he had to let her go. And in doing so, he was giving them both the chance to truly find themselves again. Max spent the next few weeks in a haze of uncertainty. Each day, a delicate balancing act between holding on to the hope that things might be okay again and accepting the painful reality that their relationship might be over. He kept his distance from Claire, giving her the space she had asked for, though every fiber of his being longed to reach out, to fix everything with a few words, a gesture, something that might mend a rift between them. But something in him had shifted. He wasn't the man who could rush in and smooth over everything anymore. He knew now that love, real love, wasn't about control or solutions. It was about allowing someone the freedom to grow, to find themselves, even if that meant they grew apart. In the stillness of their apartment, he found himself learning how to be alone. It was a strange, unsettling feeling at first. He had never really been alone before, not in the way that mattered. Sure, there had been long stretches of time where he was busy with work or when they had their own separate interests, but Claire had always been there, in the background, filling up the spaces with her presence, her laughter, her voice. But now, it was just Max in the quiet. He spent long hours at his office, putting in extra work on projects that had been piling up. But even in the middle of the chaos at work, something kept tugging at him: the thought of Claire. He wondered if she was okay. He wondered if she missed him, but he never called. He didn't push. He couldn't. One evening, after an especially long day, Max returned home to find a note from Claire on the kitchen counter. It was simple, written in her careful handwriting. "Max, I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I've realized something. I don't have all the answers. I don't even know what the future holds for us, but I do know that I need to talk to you. Not to fix anything, not to solve problems, but because I don't want to lose you entirely. I just needed time to figure things out. If you're willing to listen, I'm ready to talk." Claire. Max stood there, staring at the note in his hands, his heart thudding in his chest. He could feel the lump rise in his throat. He had known, somewhere deep inside, that Claire wasn't completely gone, that she hadn't shut him out entirely. But reading her words, seeing her vulnerability in writing, made the ache in his chest feel more intense. They were still there. The love, the connection. It had been buried beneath the weight of everything that had happened, but it hadn't disappeared. Max didn't waste any time. He grabbed his coat, left the note on the counter, and walked out of the apartment. He needed to see her. He needed to hear her voice, to finally confront everything that had been left unsaid for too long. When he arrived at Claire's favorite cafe, a small, quiet spot she had always loved, he spotted her sitting at a corner table by the window. She was alone, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring out into the rainy evening, her face soft but distant. The sight of her made his chest tighten. She looked different, not sad, not happy, but more herself. There was something in the way she carried herself now, something that spoke of growth and quiet strength, something he hadn't noticed before, when he had been so caught up in his own fears. Max stood there for a moment, unsure of how to approach her, how to breach the gap that had grown between them. But he didn't have to. Claire looked up, her eyes meeting his. And in that instant, he knew that whatever they were about to face, they would face it together. She gave him a small, tentative smile, but there was a vulnerability in her gaze that stopped him in his tracks. She had changed, yes, but so had he. They both had. And it was clear now that they weren't the same people who had entered into this relationship all those months ago. They had been on separate journeys, apart from each other, but now they were here in this moment. And maybe, just maybe, they were still meant to be. "I'm glad you came," Claire said softly, her voice carrying a note of relief. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to." Max smiled faintly, his heart still pounding in his chest. "I wasn't sure either, but I think we both need this, don't we?" Claire nodded, her expression softening. "Yeah, I think we do." They sat there for a while, the silence comfortable in its own way. It wasn't an awkward silence, the kind that hung heavy and unresolved. This was a silence that felt full of potential, full of something neither of them had been able to articulate in the months before. It wasn't about finding answers right away, but about simply being present with each other, allowing the conversation to unfold at its own pace. Eventually, Claire spoke, her voice steady. "I've been thinking about everything we've been through, and I realized something important, something I didn't want to admit before. I've spent so much of my life trying to please others, trying to make everything around me perfect. And in doing that, I lost myself. I didn't know who I was anymore, or what I wanted. And I thought that if I could make this relationship work, if I could make you happy, maybe I could figure it out." Max listened, his heart aching for the woman across from him. He knew now what she had been through, how she had been carrying this burden on her shoulders without even realizing it. He had never understood the depth of her struggle, but he did now. "I'm sorry I didn't see it before," Max said, his voice thick with regret. "I was so focused on what I thought was the problem that I couldn't see you. The real you, the part that was buried underneath all the pressure. I was too busy trying to fix things, Claire. And I know that wasn't what you needed." Claire smiled, a small, soft smile that reached her eyes. "I think we both missed a lot of things, Max. But I don't blame you. I wasn't honest with myself, and I couldn't expect you to be able to fix something I wasn't willing to face." There was a long pause, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Max felt like he could breathe again. The air between them wasn't so heavy anymore. There was an understanding, a sense of clarity. They weren't the same people who had entered this relationship, but that didn't mean they couldn't find a new way forward. "I don't know what's next," Claire said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I'm not ready to give up on us. Not yet. I want to see where this can go, but I also need to make sure I'm okay on my own first. I need to know who I am, not just who I am with you." Max nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of relief and gratitude. "I understand, and I'll be here whenever you're ready. I've learned that love isn't about holding on tight. It's about letting go and giving space to breathe, to grow." Claire's smile widened, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Max felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't fixed. They didn't have all the answers, but they were finally in a place where they could be honest, be real with each other. The future was uncertain, yes, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare Max. Whatever came next, whatever happened between them, he knew they had the time to figure it out. Together or apart, they were no longer afraid of the unknown, and that in itself was enough. Max sat in the quiet of the cafe long after Claire had left, her words still echoing in his mind. The conversation had been a turning point, the first real step they had taken toward understanding each other. It wasn't a neat, clean resolution, but it was real, and in its rawness, it felt more honest than anything he had experienced with her in months. He took a slow sip from his coffee, the warmth of the mug grounding him. It had been a long journey to get to this point, and as he thought about it, he realized how much had shifted within him, not just in terms of his relationship with Claire, but in how he saw himself. The man who had entered this relationship was different from the one sitting here now. Max had always thought of himself as someone who could control situations, someone who could fix things. But now he understood just how misguided that belief had been. He had tried so hard to mold their relationship into something that fit his idea of success, of happiness. But he hadn't really listened to Claire. He hadn't seen her for who she truly was, or more importantly, who she had the potential to become. He thought back to the earlier days of their relationship, when everything had felt effortless, when he had admired her energy, her ambition, her confidence. But somewhere along the way, he had taken her strength for granted. He had expected her to keep giving without considering the toll it was taking on her. He'd wanted her to be perfect, not in a superficial sense, but in a way that would complete him. He hadn't recognized how much of her was slipping away in the process. The realization hit him hard. He had spent so much time focusing on his own needs, his own insecurities, that he hadn't noticed Claire's quiet retreat. She hadn't been asking him to fix everything. She had been asking for space to grow, to become who she needed to be. And he hadn't given her that. Not until it was almost too late. But even now, as he thought about the possibility of them continuing their relationship, he realized something else. He couldn't be the man she needed unless he first became the man he needed to be. And that was something he hadn't fully understood until now. He had to be okay on his own, not just for Claire, but for himself. He had always been defined by external measures, success, wealth, control. But the longer he sat in the stillness of his thoughts, the clearer it became that true fulfillment didn't come from external validation. It came from within, from accepting oneself, flaws and all, and from allowing others the space to do the same. Max had spent too much time trying to make things work instead of letting things work. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Claire again. Max read Claire's message again, feeling a wave of warmth flood through him. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for seeing me." Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight that landed deep within him. For the first time in their relationship, he felt like he was truly present for her. He hadn't just heard her, he had understood her. And that made all the difference. He let out a long breath, his fingers tapping lightly on the cafe table. There was no immediate rush to respond, no pressure to put things right. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to force an outcome. He had spent so much of his life chasing solutions, trying to control the narrative, but now he understood that some things were just out of his hands. All he could do was allow space for the healing, for the change, and for whatever might come next. Max glanced out the window, watching the rain fall steadily outside. It felt like the world was slowing down around him, giving him the time and clarity he needed to understand something profound. Sometimes, the hardest lessons in life weren't about figuring out what went wrong, but about discovering what was right all along. As he typed a simple reply to Claire, "I'm here, whenever you're ready to talk," he felt a quiet peace settle in. It wasn't a promise of instant resolution, but an acknowledgement that their journey wasn't over. They were both on their separate paths, but somewhere down the road, they would find their way back to each other. And this time, it would be different. It had to be. Max set his phone down and took another sip of his coffee, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, that felt okay. Weeks passed, and life slowly began to find a new rhythm. The tension that had hung in the apartment was no longer suffocating. Claire and Max didn't rush back into anything. Instead, they took their time. Time to rebuild, not their relationship per se, but themselves. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures to erase the past. Just small moments of connection. A shared coffee on a lazy Saturday morning. Long walks where they talked without expectation, letting the silence between them feel less like a void and more like a comfortable space. Max spent more time focusing on his own growth. He took up a few hobbies he had long forgotten, jogging through the park, reading books that didn't require him to analyze them for work. He learned to enjoy solitude, something he had never fully appreciated before. He even started therapy, not to fix himself, but to understand his own patterns, how fear and control had shaped his life in ways he hadn't realized. Slowly, he began to shed the layers of who he thought he should be, and started uncovering the man he truly was. Claire, on the other hand, continued to chase the things that brought her peace. She traveled more, reconnecting with parts of herself she had buried in the pursuit of perfection. She began painting again, something she hadn't done in years, rediscovering the joy of creating without any pressure or judgment. She reached out to friends she hadn't spoken to in months, finding solace in relationships that were more nurturing than she had allowed herself to acknowledge before. Eventually, they met again, not in a rush, but with the ease of two people who had done the work to find their way back, not just to each other, but to themselves. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real, and that, they both knew, was enough. Months later, Max and Claire sat together on the same park bench where they had once shared their quiet, uncertain moments. The city around them bustled with life, but in that moment, it felt like they were in their own world, one where the past, with all its complications, had been understood, forgiven, and laid to rest. There was no longer a rush, no pressure to have everything figured out. They had learned to move at their own pace. Claire leaned her head against his shoulder, a quiet contentment in her eyes. They didn't need to say much anymore. The silence was no longer awkward or heavy. It was just the space they had learned to share. Max looked down at her, a soft smile on his lips. He realized how much had changed, not just in their relationship, but in himself. He had let go of the need to control, to make everything fit a certain mold. And in doing so, he had found a piece he hadn't even known was missing. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Claire met his gaze and smiled, her eyes full of understanding. "I am," she said simply. "Are you?" Max thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." And for the first time, he truly believed it. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.